Alice, thank you for sitting down with us today. For our audience, would you mind giving a brief introduction to who you are and to tell us a little bit more about yourself, please?
So I started life as a primary teacher, then moved dutifully with my husband down to Brighton and ended up in early years in Brighton. So decided after my first foray into early years, I wasn't going back to primary. Went back to Glasgow, worked in some schools, some nurseries, and then ended up lecturing. And then I took a job on for the independent nurseries, the private nurseries in Scotland, where I set up their training organisation, and then eventually bought that. So now I travel all over the world talking about early years and children, and I love it.
Amazing. Well, that leads me straight into my first question, actually. It's so well placed. So you've spoken about the importance of teamwork in early year settings. And what I'd love to do is just explore how did your move from primary school teaching to the nursery environment change your perspective on collaboration and leadership?
I think that's one of the reasons that I really didn't want to go back to primary. When you're in primary, you're on your own in a classroom. And I had reception, so I had 35 4-year-olds on my own. And that's an impossibility to do that at any quality standard. So I very quickly loved being part of a team. It's also why I've never been an independent consultant. I've always had a team because you bounce off of each other. And I think leading a team is much easier when you have people who think the same as you and your value principle base. Like, there's nothing we do that we never start with anything but the child. Like, I'm on a group just now, we're going to China. There's an architect, there's a furniture designer, there's a neuroscientist, I'm the pedagogue, and there's an outdoor person. And when we're having our kind of practice training and we're talking about how we're going to start, they want policy or they want this or that. And I'm like, no, you can't do any of that. None of us would exist without the child first. And so everything needs to be about the child. And I think that's easier to do in a nursery as part of a team than it is as a classroom teacher on your own.
My first thought when you just described how diverse that working group was how do you bring all that perspective together? But I love that sentiment of focusing on the child.
And I mean, we're sitting here at the expo surrounded by all of those people.
Yeah.
But we don't cross-contaminate very often. So to stand on a stage and sit in that working group, the design group for the World Forum, is a joy and a privilege because you're gaining insight into different aspects of what we do in a much deeper level.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've heard you often talk about outdoor learning and its value in children's development. What do you believe are the most important aspects of outdoor play that practitioners should focus on, and especially in today's more structured educational environment?
I think what I say might be controversial. I am not an outdoor specialist, and for a lot of years, to be honest, I avoided talking about it. If people phoned us and said we want a day on outdoor, I'd say, well, there's better people than me. Yeah. But actually, for me, it's really important that, especially now, we recognise the fact that it's not about bringing everything inside, outside. It is about nature. It is about the wonder of the world. And I think we've lost sight of that. And so if you look at biophilia, for instance, that is, every human is born with an affinity to the nature. But we don't encourage that in the children. Like lots of forest school practitioners will say to me, but we are supposed to step back and let them risk and did it. But you need to be talking to them, because how will they ever know the different trees if you don't tell them about the different trees? And I think outdoors gives you the freedom to be freer in building the maths concepts, the science concepts and the language that children need in a much more nurturing environment than indoors. And it is much more freeing to do child-led. But child-led does not mean abandonment. It means that we still have an absolute need to bring in some structure to their thinking. Not to their doing maybe, but to their thinking.
And do you think that's perhaps where we've overcorrected somewhat in the sector for about a time, in the sense that we've moved far more towards structured outcomes rather than maybe structuring the learning to help children design their own or create their own outcomes?
Yes, and the reality is I always say that I might set an environment up and it's not led by an outcome, but it doesn't mean I don't intend learning to happen.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't lead with a learning intention, but I know by putting these materials out, the chances are they'll explore the concept of buoyancy or floating and sinking or whatever it is that I put out. Because children are really astute, they're really bright, intelligent little humans. Yeah. And so we need to leave them, but I think I'm a bit concerned that we've gone to so free and so child-led, then that there's not enough structure in structuring the thoughts of the children again, and the doing, like, it shouldn't be 45 minutes of this and 45 minutes of that and 45, that's the kind of structure of old.
Yeah.
But the contemporary structure needs to look different because the children are different. But the word structure seems to have become a scary word, and actually structure is a good thing, if you get it right.
Yeah, it feels like there needs to be sort of a meeting in the middle, if you like.
Yeah.
You know, that actually brings me on, because I've got a balance question now for you.
Okay.
With your wealth of experience, how do you balance innovation and creativity in early years practice with the demands of policy and external pressures?
I kind of ignore policy.
Yeah.
I don't ignore policy because the policymakers are there, and that's fine. But take, for instance, we're launching something today, yesterday, the Early Learning Lab. And what we've done is we've tried to take away all the noise, all of the policy and curriculum. Like nothing I do is curriculum based. It's based on skills, on dispositions for play, and on pedagogy. It's why do we do it and how do we do it? The what is there. You know, we all understand how the brain develops. We all understand how language develops. We all understand how physicality develops. And that's not going to change in the next 20 years, 30 years massively. So we can still present materials and resources, but what needs to change is the way we think about that. And so I don't think that that's against the policies of today. I think the policies are there to be interpreted. They're there to keep us all safe and a wee bit contained, I guess. But then if you look at some of the outcomes of our country compared to other countries, then we're getting worse. So maybe the policies need to be a wee bit more child-focused and not let's put them in a school building. You know, yesterday the minister was interesting what he was saying, and I love the fact he was talking a lot about SEND, he was talking about neurodiversity, he was talking a lot about childminders, which is brilliant because it's all a big important part of our melting pot. But actually the policies need to change in relation to the children, not all of those parts of the sector, the children first, because children in the alpha generation and the beta generation are so different. Their brains are wired completely differently.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that new technology and science is telling us about a child's development today that kind of conflicts, or not conflicts, but certainly takes the direction away from perhaps what education has looked like over the last 40 or 50 years. I think that's... I always liken it to turning the Titanic, though, to some extent.
It takes about 3 years to turn it.
Yeah. And by then there's new science, new technology.
Exactly. And yesterday in my session on language development, I was talking, and I know this is really controversial. You know, that if you think about all of it, I love Vygotsky, I love Piaget, I love Fribble. You know, all of these people I know stand on their shoulders as giants, but none of them have met the children of today. And one of the things I remember saying to you before is that if we've got a parent who is 22 years old and a parent who's 45 years old, the experience the child has in their life, in their home life, and what they do at the weekends is very different to each other. And then they come in, so our play needs to be vastly different to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and vastly different for both of those children. And so one size cannot fit all, and I feel as if the policies look at one size, and so they need to be much more focused on, okay, what do all of these children need?
Yeah, broader learning outcomes that are not measured by attendance or one single level of attainment, if you like. Yeah.
And if you think about even an accountant or the Chancellor of the Exchequer, God, I hope he's creative or she's creative. And so, you know, we have these science kind of outcomes, and we have these creativity and critical thinking outcomes, and sometimes never the twain shall meet.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we love about what we do, is that we start with the skills and dispositions and the pedagogy. Like, we know why we're doing it, how are we doing it?
Yeah.
And how am I doing it for you is different to how I do it for him and her and them. And so the reality is that as as educators, we need to be so differently skilled to what we do. I'm 36 years in the sector, and the way I approach play, even since last year, since we were filming this new thing we're doing, I am thinking about play differently again.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'd love to just come back to that point around sort of how far education has moved on, or how far the science has moved on, but education hasn't. Because it brings us this really interesting point around the previous conversations.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned in the past about empathy, something that we're possibly lacking, or we've discussed it, of course. I don't want to put words in your mouth, that there's empathy possibly lacking in the younger workforces, yet the older generations sometimes struggle to relate to modern family life. So how can earlier settings perhaps bridge this generational gap among practitioners to create a more cohesive team?
That is a huge question, and I always say that we are the biggest resource a child has access to. So anybody who interacts with a child is an educator. And you're absolutely right. We've got these younger educators who don't know how to play themselves. They have lived in this generation, my two children being two of them, that have always had instant internet access.
Yes.
So my son, for instance, has knowledge about so many things I don't have knowledge about. But is it at a deep enough level? Because too much information is overload, but actually really understanding how physical development happens, or really understanding child development for me is key to everything. That we need to understand that, and we can go through a whole qualification in our sector now without being taught child development. And if you have a young person learning from another young person, or from an older person who is not in tune with the way of the world now, the contemporary way we live our lives now. I don't think we should have all this technology in the nursery. And I would have been one of them 5 years ago, but now we have to be real. There's robots doing everything, every job. There's cars that don't have a driver in it. And it doesn't matter what age you are in the sector, that is the reality of our children and what they're growing up into. So we need to grab that, embrace it, and somehow make sense of it with the children. And so the ongoing training needs of the sector is huge. It used to be that it took about 25 to 27 years for science to come out of the world of academia and down to us on the floor. We are now expected to respond to science within 3.5 years, because there's so much new understanding of children and childhood and contemporary worlds that we live in. So we have to be so up to date all the time. So if I graduated 10 years ago, that's not good enough anymore. I need to be constantly upskilling.
Yeah, that sort of continuous desire for improvement, not just in the sector or in the way that we develop children, but that continuous desire for improvement in yourself is just always shines through. It's
massive. And one of the things that I kind of become a bit obsessive, I suppose, and I found out, I read something about the effort-driven reward cycle. I think I talked to you about it before, but it's all health papers and science that I'm reading. But if that's saying to me that it helps if we do things with our hands, so the effort-driven reward cycle is basically we were born to do things with our hands as humans, and we do less and less things with our hands now. We don't chop our food up to cook it, we put it in the microwave, we don't garden as much because we might pay somebody to do our gardening or whatever. But there's a huge correlation between depression, anxiety, suicidal tendencies. All of these things are related to not doing things with your hands. So there's loads of scientific medical suggestion that alongside the medication, we need to start doing pottery or gardening or making cards or something with your hands. Now, that's what we do every day with children. We do things with our hands. We play with our hands. So actually, in the old folks' homes, give them play materials, you know, and the nursery at Belong in Chester is doing exactly that. When you watch the videos of the nursery at Belong, oh my Lord, these older friends that they have playing with the children are playing with the same materials as the children and gaining so much from it.
Oh, I absolutely love these, the sort of progression of the intergenerational projects now. I think they're just warms my heart. Particularly like my son and my daughter's school, they for reading and writing, one of the I guess rewards, but one of the things they do to incentivize the kids is that at the end of each term they'll go and do a reading day with the older generations in the care homes and spend time. And they always come back having just learned the most amazing things from these people and had the greatest experience.
And wouldn't that be, you mentioned policy earlier on?
Yeah.
The policy of putting 3,000 new nursery classes in schools, put them in the old folks' homes. You know, let's do that instead. There's a policy right there for you. That then makes the older generation that there are more of feel valued and of benefit to society still as they get older, and the younger generation learning from that huge life experience that they're sharing. That to me would be a brilliant policy instead of putting them into schools. Let's put them in somewhere where it benefits more than just themselves but everybody.
The thing that really worries or sort of disturbs me a little bit about the idea of early years getting closer and into schools is the PIF, the funding program, coming back as well, because it would seem to me that then what you end up with is this sort of contracted obligation to almost structure early years in the way that schools, that conformist teacher questions, pupil answers kind of classroom environment that we know is so wrong for a child's development these days.
And even more than that, I can't tell you how many head teachers of primary schools I've spoken to that say they don't understand and they don't know, so they just let them go on with it. Now, if you're the management leader of that class and you're letting them go on with it and not questioning the quality that's been offered, that can't be a good thing.
No.
And even, like, I'll give you one example, that the 2 to 3 year olds go to the dinner hall for dinner, for lunch, and they've got 20 minutes to eat their lunch before the next class come in. 20 minutes for 2 to 3 year olds to eat lunch, are you having a laugh? That isn't manageable.
No.
But in the bigger scheme of a school, that's how they have to manage it. And so that's not fair on anybody, because it is not good for the 2 and 3 year olds, but also it has a knock-on effect to everybody.
So looking at the future of early years education, what are some of the key areas you feel need more attention? How do you think practitioners can better support a children's holistic development?
I mean, how long have you got really for that answer? I think we can do it. I think we can do it because as a society we want to do it. So that's the first thing. We know we need to change, and we know that we want to change. So, and we know why we need to change. Well, some of us do. And how actually is about upskilling us. It's about changing your mindset. It's about understanding how children develop and learn now compared to last year. And so I think the policies, if we're going to start with policy, but I'd rather start with the child. And it needs to be that we have some kind of overriding framework, whether it's a curriculum or not, I'm not sure, that will advise us about development. The children this year, this is what the sequence looks like. And so here are some suggestions that might help you, but it depends if you're in a rural school or you're in an inner city school. Like one of the wee island schools that I've worked on, they go onto the beach and they pick up broken glass and they do sort and matching, and they do painting and mix, they do all sorts of science with it. I couldn't do that in an inner city school because it's not relevant. So what we create now moving forward, and we need to create something severely different, needs to be relevant to the children that are in that building at that time. That if you look at one of the London nurseries does drag queen story time, and they do drag queen story time because the children were asking about the strange looking people outside the nursery. So that's relevant for them, but it doesn't mean I'm going to do it in an island in Scotland, because it's not. That's not what they need. But that's what we tend to have done in the past. Well, there's Reggio, let's take that and try it here. Let's try the Finnish model, let's try the Swedish model. We need a British model that is fit for Britain and fit for Britain today. And so my hope is that the government and the people like Neil and June and all these people that are in that kind of level, which is, I'm a practitioner, I don't want to be having those conversations, but I'm happy for them if they know what they're talking about to make my framework for me, and then I can interpret it for whatever classroom I find myself or nursery I find myself in. So I think we need more of a framework that is reflective of a contemporary understanding of children and how they develop and learn. And I think one of the biggest things after 36 years, if there was a top tip, is don't just read about early years. Read about children in lots of different ways, where their mental health ends up, where their physical health ends up. So I know we're not getting them ready to live the rest of their lives, but we're building the foundations as strongly as we can. So we need to know what we're building on top of it. And so for me, I very much, for the first 10 years, 12 years of my career, only looked at early years. But in the last 20, I've always looked out of early years as well, because you need to have a balance between that.
Yeah, there's so much at that age that a child doesn't yet know what to expect in life, is there? And that resilience and kind of probably emotions that are, sadly are present in younger years, but certainly as you get older and slightly more independent, that elicit, say, like anxiety and fear or stress that they wouldn't necessarily know.
And you mentioned the empathy earlier on. Some of the science tells us that if we don't develop empathy in the first 3 years, you're never going to develop empathy. Realistically, Christine Pickering's work is brilliant on that, and Bruce Perry's work as well on trauma. But the reality of that is terrifying. That if we don't have an empathetic society going forward, and actually a lot of the younger generation of staff in the nurseries, I hate to say this, but I don't think they care enough because they don't know enough. They don't know what it is they've got to care about. So if we're trying to develop empathy and they don't have empathy towards that, the cycle's just going to fall to bits.
Yeah.